Hi there, Year 8. It's Mrs. Honey again. I'm doing you a lesson on continuous and discontinuous variation. So hopefully by the end of this topic, you'll be able to describe the differences between continuous and discontinuous variation and be able to represent it within a species, okay, using some sort of graphs. So you better make sure you've got yourself a pen and a piece of paper and you're ready to make a start. Okay, so first thing we want to do is to recap what we already know about variation. Hopefully in your last lesson you looked at this idea that humans vary, even twins can differ. I know that my twins, I've got a boy and a girl, they completely different. So we have to understand what happens with variation, and variation is based on two things, inherited variation and environmental variation. And hopefully you've got some idea now that there are inherited things that you get from your parents, such as eye colour, and then there are environmental things, such as whether you're good at, say, tennis or whether you've got a scar. It's really important that we can understand that some things can also come under the category of both, in which it's inherited, but also the environment can change it too. So for this recap task, all I want you to do is write out the paragraph below. Find the different variations of the species in the paragraph and highlight them to show what has caused the variation. So is it an environmental, an inherited variation, or is it both? On a visit to the zoo, a student saw lots of different types of big cat. In the pride of lions, the males had manes, but the females didn't. There was one lion with a big scar on its face. Some of the lions were a little overweight. All of the tigers had stripes, whilst all of the leopards had spots. Some of the leopards were larger than the others. So we talk about variation with two headings, discontinuous and continuous. So when we represent data about variation, we can represent it in two different ways. We can use a bar chart or we can use a histogram. A bar chart tends to be used with discontinuous variation. This is a characteristic that's only got certain values, tend to be in categories. So there's either one or so answer, for example, if you're male or female. Other characteristics that can show discontinuous variations are things like your blood group and eye colour. Continuous variation, though, has a range. So, for example, the height of a population can range from the shortest person in the world to the tallest person. Our characteristics that show continuous variation are things like your body mass, your hair length, your arm span. These are all things that can change. If it's a discontinuous variation, as I said, we could plot that in a bar chart, and if it's continuous, we plot it in a histogram, so we can then look at the data. Okay, so under the heading continuous variation and under the heading discontinuous variation, we can identify a definition of the two. Continuous variation then has no limit to the value that can occur within a population. It's shown as a histogram or a line graph, and discontinuous has groups or distinct categories shown in a bar chart with gaps. So for this task, below there's a list of variations: blood group, weight, foot length, eye colour, height, ability to roll your tongue, shoe size, and length of fingers. Draw yourself out a little table on a piece of paper, and all I want you to do is decide whether or not it's continuous or discontinuous, and write them under the right heading. At the end of the PowerPoint, I'll go through the answers and you can mark your own work. If you need to pause the video to take a bit more time, feel free to do that. So when it comes to plotting variation, discontinuous variation, we go for the bar graph. Continuous variation, you'd go for the histogram. On the next few slides, we're going to look at plotting some data. Okay, so now we're going to look at how we plot the data. Here I've given you some data. because we would normally do this in the classroom and I'd ask you to go around and measure everybody's arm span. Unfortunately, we can't do that. So I've had to give you some data so that you can use that to plot your graph. So here is a table, shows the number of students and for each arm span. And here is a axis that I've provided with the number of students against the arm span. All I want you to do is to plot the data. Think about what kind of data it is. What kind of graph would you have? You'll need to pause the video now so that you'll be able to complete this. Okay, so here are two questions to get you thinking about the type of data that we're talking about for continuous and discontinuous variation. So this question asks, if a histogram is a type of graph that is used to represent data visually, what features would that histogram need to display? So having a think, here are your 6 options. The independent variable should be plotted on the x-axis. Each bar should represent one value. Data should be plotted as small crosses. The dependent variable should be plotted on the x-axis. There should be no gaps between the bars, and each bar should represent a range of values. So there are 3 correct answers to identify there. And then thinking about that, and thinking about variation and how we show that, a student carried out an investigation and collected data on characteristics. I want you to write out the headings here and put each characteristic under the right one. So the characteristics you've got is the mass of plants, the time taken to run 400 metres, the height of people, the eye colour, the blood group, the gender of the couple's first child, number of animals per litre, length of a carrot, arm span, the ability to roll your tongue. Which one would you represent as histograms and which would you represent as a bar chart? Again, if you need to pause the video at any point so that you've got time to get this down, do so. Okay, so now we understand a little bit about a variation, and we've identified the difference between discontinuous variation and continuous variation. Now we need to think about how we could summarise that information. So here are 4 questions for you. Copy and complete the sentence. Characteristics that can only result in a certain value show variation. Characteristics that can have any value within a range show variation. The range of values of a characteristic from a sample can be displayed using a characteristic such as eye colour should be displayed using a. And characteristics showing continuous variation, such as body mass, should be shown using a. There's 5 marks available for that question. Question 2. Classify each of the characteristics into continuous variation and discontinuous variation. So here are the categories you've got. Length of arm, hair colour, maximum sprinting speed, shoe size, average leaf size. Again, 5 marks. You can put it in a little table if you like. Question 3. Look at the graph of variation in heights on this page. Describe the pattern that this variation shows. Explain whether this variation is a result of the environment factors or inherited factors or both. So have a look at the graph. I've put it on here for you. Question 4. Explain in detail the difference between the continuous and discontinuous variation using examples of features from the human body. There's 6 marks available. There's 6 marks available on the previous question too. You've got a total of 22 marks that you can get here. So have a time to think about the answers. Maybe pause the video for a little bit and have a look at the graph in detail. Okay, so that was the end of that lesson. Hopefully you've got a lovely graph and some answers to some questions, and hopefully we can go through some of those and we can correct any that you got wrong and have a look at the ones you got right. I'm sure you did really well. So please make sure you mark your work and make sure you reflect on your findings. Okay, so time to go through some answers and mark the work that you have completed. Make sure you've got it in front of you and use a different colour pen to mark. So the first thing I asked you to do was to recap what you've learnt in your other lessons. And we had this paragraph. On a visit to the zoo, a student saw lots of different types of big cat. In the pride of the lions, the males had a mane. That was an inherited variation. The females didn't. There was one lion with a big scar, environmental. Some of the lions were a little overweight. Again, another environmental factor. All the tigers had stripes, while all the leopards had spots. These are both inherited. And some of the leopards were larger than the others. And this can be both. This can be an inherited thing, but it also could be to do with their environment. So hopefully you've got all 6 correct. Well done. Okay, so for task 2, all you needed to do was to identify whether it was continuous or discontinuous. So continuous would have been the length of fingers, the foot length, the weight and the height. Notice here that length, weight and height are the key words that we're using. They're things that can be measured and can be different. Discontinuous, you should have shoe size, eye colour, blood group and ability to roll your tongue. So these are things that you have a specific size and that's it. It's a category. And if it's a category, it's a bar graph. And if it's not a category and it's continuous, remember, it's a histogram. Okay, so for this task, you needed to investigate the arm span. And you need to give me data represented in a graph. So hopefully you've ended up with a graph that looks a bit like this. It should have the number of students labelled on its axis. That's 1 mark. The arm span labelled on its axis with the measurement of metres, that's 1 mark. The bar data given and plotted correctly, it's 1 mark. And the line showing the relationship, that's another mark. So there's 4 marks that you should be able to get from drawing this data. So have a look at yours. Does it look the same? So for this task, you had to identify the features that the histogram should display. So for the graph that we were looking at, it's really important that the independent variable goes on the x-axis. There's no gaps between the bars, and each bar represents the range of values. So if you look back at the other one, our graph showed a range between 1.01 to 1.1, and that's the bar. You then had to identify where you would plot data, whether it would be a histogram or a bar chart. So the height of people, the mass of plants, the arm span, the time taken to run 400 metres, and the length of a carrot would be a histogram. A bar chart would include things like blood group, eye colour, ability to roll your tongue, number of animals per litter, the gender of the first couple's first child. Mark your work, make sure you got it right, and if you didn't, make sure you correct it. Try to explain why if you got it wrong. What would the answer, or should the answer, have been? Okay, and then the summary answers are given here for you. So you should have completed all 4 questions, and you should be able to mark with the mark scheme. So for the first 5 marks, you needed to have discontinuous, continuous, graph, bar chart, histogram. Question 2, continuous, length of arm, maximum sprinting speed, average leaf size. For discontinuous, hair colour and shoe size. 3A, most people are of an average height, around 150 centimetres. Few people were very short, below that of 135 centimetres, and few people were very tall, above 170 centimetres. 3 marks. It's really important there that for the 3 marks, you've given the example of the average height and the peak of where that would be, and that you've mentioned that some would be lower and some would be higher. For 3B, height is affected by both inherited and environmental factors. If your parents are tall, you're likely to be tall. That's inherited. However, growth can be affected by environmental factors such as malnutrition. So 3 marks, again, for being able to identify that there is both inherited and environmental factors, and then being able to give that example of the inherited being linked to your parents being tall, and the environmental factors being linked to something along the lines of malnourishment. For 4, the example answers are: continuous variation is a variation that can take any value within a range. For example, height, body mass, arm span, hair length, or length of feet. Continuous data should be plotted on a histogram. A line is often added to the histogram to see the shape of the graph. This type of variation usually produces a curve known as a normal distribution. Discontinuous variation is a variation that can result in certain values. For example, gender, blood type, eye colour, or shoe size. Discontinuous variation should be plotted as a bar chart. So this question asks for 6 marks. Being able to identify that continuous variation can take a value within a range would give you 1 mark. Being able to say that continuous data should be plotted on a histogram would give you 1 mark. Being able to identify that variation produces a curve known as a normal distribution would give you 1 mark. It doesn't matter if you haven't used the word normal distribution, as long as you've mentioned about the curve. Discontinuous variation is a variation that can result in certain values. That would give you 1 mark. And then for the discontinuous variation, saying that it's plotted on a bar chart would give you another mark. And if you've given examples for one or both of them, you'd get that 6th mark. That brings us to the end of the lesson. Been through the answers. Please feel free to go back and look at this PowerPoint again if it helps you. Make sure if you've got anything incorrect that you go through and correct it. I hope you've enjoyed the lesson, and I look forward to doing another lesson with you soon. Bye.